Chapter 22 of Steep Trails. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Dennison. Steep Trails by John Muir. The Forests of Oregon and Their Inhabitants. Like the forests of Washington already described, those of Oregon are in great part made up of the Douglas spruce, or Oregon pine, Abies douglasii. A large number of mills are at work upon these species, especially along the Columbia, but these as yet have made but little impression upon its dense masses, the mills here being small as compared with those of the Puget Sound region. The white cedar or Port Orford cedar, Cupressus lawsoniana, or Chamaecyparis lawsoniana, is one of the most beautiful of the evergreens and produces excellent lumber, considerable quantities of which are shipped to the San Francisco market. It is found mostly about Coos Bay along the Coquille River and on the northern slopes of the Siskiyou Mountains, and extends down the coast into California. The silver firs, the spruces, and the colossal arbor vitae, or white cedar, Thuya gigantea, described in the chapter on Washington, are also found here in great beauty and perfection. The largest of these, Picea grandis Loudon, Abies grandis Lindley, being confined mostly to the coast region, where it attains a height of 300 feet and a diameter of 10 or 12 feet. 5 or 6 species of pines are found in the state, the most important of which, both as to lumber and as to the part they play in the general wealth and beauty of the forests, are the yellow and sugar pines, Pinus ponderosa and Pinus lambertiana. The yellow pine is most abundant on the eastern slopes of the Cascades, forming there the main bulk of the forest in many places. It is also common along the borders of the open spaces in Willamette Valley. In the southern portion of the state, the sugar pine, which is the king of all pines and the glory of the Sierra forests, occurs in considerable abundance in the basins of the Umpqua and Rogue rivers, and it was in the Umpqua Hills that this noble tree was first discovered by the enthusiastic botanical explorer David Douglas in the year 1826. This is the Douglas for whom the noble Douglas spruce is named, and many a fair blooming plant also, which will serve to keep his memory fresh and sweet as long as beautiful trees and flowers are loved. The Indians of the lower Columbia River watched him with lively curiosity as he wandered about the woods day after day, gazing intently on the ground or at the great trees, collecting specimens of everything he saw, but, unlike all the eager fur-gathering strangers they had hitherto seen, caring nothing about trade. And when at length they came to know him better, and saw that from year to year the growing things of the woods and prairies, meadows and plains, were his only object of pursuit, they called him the Man of Grass, a title of which he was proud. He was a Scotchman and first came to this coast in the spring of 1825 under the auspices of the London Horticultural Society, landing at the mouth of the Columbia after a long dismal voyage of 8 months and 14 days. During this first season he chose Fort Vancouver, belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company, as his headquarters, and from there made excursions into the glorious wilderness in every direction, discovering many new species among the trees, as well as among the rich underbrush and smaller herbaceous vegetation. It was while making a trip to Mount Hood this year that he discovered the 2 largest and most beautiful firs in the world, Picea amabilis and Picea nobilis, now called Abies, and from the seeds which he then collected and sent home tall trees are now growing in Scotland. In one of his trips that summer in the lower Willamette Valley, he saw in an Indian's tobacco pouch some of the seeds and scales of a new species of pine, which, he learned, were gathered from a large tree that grew far to the southward. Most of the following season was spent in the upper waters of the Columbia, and it was not until September that he returned to Fort Vancouver, about the time of the setting in of the winter rains. Nevertheless, bearing in mind the great pine he had heard of, and the seeds of which he had seen, he made haste to set out on an excursion to the headwaters of the Willamette in search of it, and how he fared on this excursion and what dangers and hardships he endured is best told in his own journal, part of which I quote as follows. October 26, 1826. Weather dull. cold and cloudy. When my friends in England are made acquainted with my travels, I fear they will think that I have told them nothing but my miseries. I quitted my camp early in the morning to survey the neighboring country, leaving my guide to take charge of the horses until my return in the evening. About an hour's walk from the camp, I met an Indian who, on perceiving me instantly, strung his bow, placed on his left arm a sleeve of raccoon skin, and stood on the defensive. Being quite sure that conduct was prompted by fear and not by hostile intentions, the poor fellow having probably never seen such a being as myself before, I laid my gun at my feet on the ground, and waved my hand for him to come to me, which he did slowly and with great caution. I then made him place his bow and quiver of arrows beside my gun, and striking a light, gave him a smoke out of my own pipe and a present of a few beads. With my pencil, I made a rough sketch of the cone and pine tree which I wanted to obtain, and drew his attention to it. When he instantly pointed with his hand to the hills 15 or 20 miles distant towards the south, and when I expressed my intention of going thither, cheerfully set about accompanying me. At midday I reached my long-wished-for pines, and lost no time in examining them and endeavoring to collect specimens and seeds. New and strange things seldom fail to make strong impressions, and are therefore frequently overrated, so that, lest I should never see my friends in England to inform them verbally of this most beautiful and immensely grand tree, I shall here state the dimensions of the largest I could find among several that had been blown down by the wind. At 3 feet from the ground its circumference is 57 feet, 9 inches, and at 134 feet, 17 feet, 5 inches. The extreme length 245 feet, as it was impossible either to climb the tree or hew it down. I endeavored to knock off the cones by firing at them with ball. When the report of my gun brought 8 Indians, all of them painted with red earth, armed with bows, arrows, bone-tipped spears, and flint knives, they appeared anything but friendly. I explained to them what I wanted, and they seemed satisfied and sat down to smoke. But presently I saw one of them string his bow and another sharpen his flint knife with a pair of wooden pincers and suspend it on the wrist of his right hand. Further testimony of their intentions was unnecessary. To save myself by flight was impossible, so without hesitation I stepped back about 5 paces, cocked my gun, drew one of the pistols out of my belt, and holding it in my left hand, the gun in my right, showed myself determined to fight for my life. As much as possible I endeavored to preserve my coolness, and thus we stood looking at one another without making any movements or uttering a word for perhaps 10 minutes. When one at last, who seemed to be the leader, gave a sign that they wished for some tobacco. This I signified they should have if they fetched a quantity of cones. They went off immediately in search of them, and no sooner were they all out of sight than I picked up my 3 cones and some twigs of the trees and made the quickest possible retreat, hurrying back to my camp, which I reached before dusk. The Indian who last undertook to be my guide to the trees I sent off before gaining my encampment, lest he should betray me. How irksome is the darkness of night to one under such circumstances! I cannot speak a word to my guide, nor have I a book to divert my thoughts, which are continually occupied with the dread lest the hostile Indian should trace me hither and make an attack. I now write lying on the grass with my gun cocked beside me, and penning these lines by the light of my Columbian candle, namely, an ignited piece of rosin wood. Douglas named this magnificent species Pinus lambertiana, in honor of his friend Dr. Lambert of London. This is the noblest pine thus far discovered in the forest of the world, surpassing all others not only in size but in beauty and majesty. Oregon may well be proud that its discovery was made within her borders, and that, though it is far from abundant in California, she has the largest known specimens. In the Sierra, the finest sugar pine forests lie at an elevation of about 5,000 feet. In Oregon, they occupy much lower ground, some of the trees being found but little above tide water. No lover of trees will ever forget his first meeting with the sugar pine. In most coniferous trees, there is a sameness of form and expression which at length becomes wearisome to most people who travel far in the woods. But the sugar pines are as free from conventional forms as any of the oaks. No two are so much alike as to hide their individuality from any observer. Every tree is appreciated as a study in itself and proclaims in no uncertain terms the surpassing grandeur of the species. The branches, mostly near the summit, are sometimes nearly 40 feet long, feathered richly all around with short, leafy branchlets, and tasseled with cones of a foot and a half long. And when these superb arms are outspread, radiating in every direction, an immense crown-like mass is formed, which, poised on the noble shaft and filled with sunshine, is one of the grandest forest objects conceivable. But though so wild and unconventional when full grown, the sugar pine is a remarkably regular tree in youth, a strict follower of coniferous fashions, slim, erect, tapering, symmetrical, every branch in place. At the age of 50 or 60 years, this shy, fashionable form begins to give way. Special branches are thrust out away from the general outlines of the trees and bent down with cones. Henceforth, it becomes more and more original and independent in style, pushes boldly aloft into the winds and sunshine, growing ever more stately and beautiful, a joy and inspiration to every beholder. Unfortunately, the sugar pine makes excellent lumber. It is too good to live, and is already passing rapidly away before the woodman's axe. Surely out of all of the abounding forest wealth of Oregon, a few specimens may be spared to the world, not as dead lumber, but as living trees. A park of moderate extent might be set apart and protected for public use forever, containing at least a few hundreds of each of these noble pines, spruces, and firs. Happy will be the men who, having the power and the love and benevolent forecast to do this, will do it. They will not be forgotten. The trees and their lovers will sing their praises, and generations yet unborn will rise up and call them blessed. Dotting the prairies and fringing the edges of the great evergreen forest, we find a considerable number of hardwood trees, such as oak, maple, ash, alder, laurel, madrone, flowering dogwood, wild cherry, and wild apple. The white oak, Quercus garryana, is the most important of the Oregon oaks as a timber tree, but not nearly so beautiful as Kellogg's oak, Quercus kelloggii. The former is found mostly along the Columbia River, particularly about the Dalles, and a considerable quantity of useful lumber is made from it and sold, sometimes for eastern white oak, to wagon makers. Kellogg's oak is a magnificent tree and does much for the picturesque beauty of the Umpqua and Rogue River valleys where it abounds. It is also found in all the Yosemite valleys of the Sierra, and its acorns form an important part of the food of the Digger Indians. In the Siskiyou Mountains there is a live oak, Quercus chrysolepis, wide-spreading and very picturesque in form, but not very common. It extends southward along the western flank of the Sierra and is there more abundant and much larger than in Oregon, oftentimes 5 to 8 feet in diameter. The maples are the same as those in Washington, already described, but I have not seen any maple groves here equal in extent or in the size of the trees to those on the Snoqualmie River. The Oregon ash is now rare along the stream banks of western Oregon, and it grows to a good size and furnishes lumber that is for some purposes equal to the white ash of the western states. Nuttall's flowering dogwood makes a brave display with its wealth of show involucres in the spring along cool streams. Specimens of the flowers may be found measuring 8 inches in diameter. The wild cherry, Prunus emerginata, variety mollis, is a small, handsome tree seldom more than a foot in diameter at the base. It makes valuable lumber, and its black, astringent fruit furnishes a rich resource as food for the birds. A smaller form is common in the Sierra, the fruit of which is eagerly eaten by the Indians and hunters in time of need. The wild apple, Pyrus rivillaris, is a fine, hearty, handsome little tree that grows well in rich, cool soil along streams and on the edges of beaver meadows. From California through Oregon and Washington to southeastern Alaska. In Oregon, it forms dense, tangled thickets, some of them almost impenetrable. The largest trunks are nearly a foot in diameter. When in bloom, it makes a fine show with its abundant clusters of flowers, which are white and fragrant. The fruit is very small and savagely acid. It is wholesome, however, and is eaten by birds, bears, Indians, and many other adventurers, great and small. Passing from beneath the shadows of the woods where the trees grow close and high, we step into charming wild gardens full of lilies, orchids, heathworts, roses, etc., with colors so gay and forming such sumptuous masses of bloom They make the gardens of civilization, however lovingly cared for, seem pathetic and silly. Around the Great Fire Mountains, above the forests and beneath the snow, there is a flowery zone of marvelous beauty planted with anemones, erythroniums, daisies, bryanthus, calmia, vaccinium, cassiope, saxifragus, etc., forming one continuous garden 50 or 60 miles in circumference, and so deep and luxuriant and closely woven, it seems as if nature, glad to find an opening, were economizing space and trying to see how many of her bright-eyed darlings she can get together in one mountain wreath. Along the slopes of the Cascades, where the woods are less dense, especially about the headwaters of the Willamette, there are miles of rhododendron, making glorious outbursts of purple bloom, and down on the prairies, in rich damp hollows, the blue-flowered camassia grows in such profusion that at a little distance its dense masses appear as beautiful blue lakes embedded in the green flowery plains, while all about the streams and the lakes and the beaver meadows and the margins of the deep woods there is a magnificent tangle of gaulteria and huckleberry bushes with their myriads of pink bells, reinforced with hazel, cornel, rubus of many species, wild plum, cherry, and crabapple, besides thousands of charming bloomers to be found in all sorts of places throughout the wilderness whose mere names are refreshing, such as Lanaya, Menciacea, Pyrola, Chimaphila, Brodii, Smilacina, Fritillaria, Calocortus, Trillium, Clintonia, Veratrum, Cypripedium, Goodyeara, Speranthus, Habenaria, and the rare and lovely Hyder of the North, Calypso borealis, to find which is alone a sufficient object for a journey into the wilderness. And besides these there is a charming underworld of ferns and mosses flourishing gloriously beneath all the woods. Everybody loves wild woods and flowers more or less. Seeds of all these Oregon evergreens and of many of the flowering shrubs and plants have been sent to almost every country under the sun, and they are now growing in carefully tended parks and gardens, and now that the ways of approach are open, one would expect to find these woods and gardens full of admiring visitors reveling in their beauty like bees in a clover field, yet few care to visit them. A portion of the bark of one of the California trees, the mere dead skin, excited the wondering attention of thousands when it was set up in the Crystal Palace in London, as did also a few peeled spars, the shafts of mere saplings from Oregon or Washington. Could one of these great silver firs or sugar pines 300 feet high have been transplanted entire to that exhibition, how enthusiastic would have been the praises accorded to it. Nevertheless, the countless hosts waving at home beneath their own sky, beside their own noble rivers and mountains, and standing on a flower-enameled carpet of mosses, thousands of square miles in extent, attract but little attention. Most travelers content themselves with what they may chance to see from car windows, hotel verandas, or the deck of a steamer on the lower Columbia, clinging to the battered highways like drowning sailors to a life raft. When an excursion into the woods is proposed, all sorts of exaggerated or imaginary dangers are conjured up, filling the kindly, soothing wilderness with colds, fevers, Indians, bears, snakes, bugs, impassable rivers, and jungles of brush, to which is always added quick and sure starvation. As to starvation, the woods are full of food, and a supply of bread may easily be carried for habit's sake, and replenished now and then at outlying farms and camps. The Indians are seldom found in the woods, being confined mainly to the banks of rivers, where the greater part of their food is obtained. Moreover, the most of them have been either buried since the settlement of the country or civilized into comparative innocence, industry, or harmless laziness. There are bears in the woods, but not in such numbers nor of such unspeakable ferocity as town dwellers imagine, nor do bears spend their lives in going about the country like the devil, seeking whom they may devour. Oregon bears, like most others, have no liking for man, either as meat or as society, and while some may be curious at times to see what manner of creature he is, most of them have learned to shun people as deadly enemies. They have been poisoned, trapped, and shot at until they have become shy, and it is no longer easy to make their acquaintance. Indeed, since the settlement of the country, notwithstanding for the greater portion is yet wild, it is difficult to find any of the larger animals that once were numerous and comparatively familiar, such as the bear, wolf, panther, lynx, deer, elk, and antelope. As early as 1843, while the settlers numbered only a few thousands, and before any sort of government had been organized, they came together and held what they called a wolf meeting, at which a committee was appointed to devise means for the destruction of wild animals destructive to tame ones, which committee in due time begged to report as follows: It being admitted by all that bears, wolves, panthers, etc., are destructive to the useful animals owned by the settlers of this colony, your committee would submit the following resolutions as the sense of this meeting, by which the community may be governed in carrying on a defensive and destructive war on all such animals. Resolved, first, that we deem it expedient for the community to take immediate measures for the destruction of all wolves, panthers, and bears, and such other animals as are known to be destructive to cattle, horses, sheep, and hogs. Second, that a bounty of 50 cents be paid for the destruction of a small wolf, $3 for a large wolf, $1.50 for a lynx, $2 for a bear, and $5 for a panther. This center of destruction was in the Willamette Valley, but for many years prior to the beginning of the operations of the wolf organization, the Hudson's Bay Company had established forts and trading stations over all the country, wherever fur-gathering Indians could be found, and vast numbers of these animals were killed. Their destruction has since gone on at an accelerated rate from year to year, as the settlements have been extended, so that in some cases it is difficult to obtain specimens enough for the use of naturalists. But even before any of these settlements were made, and before the coming of the Hudson's Bay Company, there was very little danger to be met in passing through this wilderness as far as animals were concerned, and but little, if any, kind as compared with the dangers encountered in crowded houses and streets. When Lewis and Clark made their famous trip across the continent in 1804–5, when all the Rocky Mountain regions were wild, as well as the Pacific slope, they did not lose a single man by wild animals, nor, though frequently attacked, especially by the grizzlies of the Rocky Mountains, were any of them wounded seriously. Captain Clark was bitten on the hand by a wolf as he lay asleep. That was one bite among more than 100 men while traveling through 8,000 to 9,000 miles of savage wilderness. They could hardly have been so fortunate had they stayed at home. They wintered on the edge of the Clatsop Plains on the south side of the Columbia River near its mouth. In the woods on the side they found game abundant, especially elk, and with the aid of the friendly Indians who furnished salmon and wapatoo, the tubers of Sagittaria variabilis, they were in no danger of starving. But on the return trip in the spring, they reached the base of the Rocky Mountains when the range was yet too heavily snow-laden to be crossed with horses. Therefore, they had to wait some weeks. This was at the head of one of the northern branches of the Snake River, and their scanty stock of provisions being nearly exhausted, the whole party was compelled to live mostly on bears and dogs. Deer, antelope, and elk, usually abundant, were now scarce because the region had been closely hunted over by the Indians before their arrival. Lewis and Clark had killed a number of bears and saved the skins of the more interesting specimens, and the variations they found in size, color of the hair, etc., made great difficulty in classification. Wishing to get the opinion of the Chopumish Indians, near one of whose villages they were encamped, concerning the various species, the explorers unpacked their bundles and spread out for examination all the skins they had taken. The Indian hunters immediately classed the white, the deep and the pale grizzly red, the grizzly dark brown, in short, all those with the extremities of the hair of a white or frosty color, without regard to the color of the ground or foil, under the name of ho-host. The Indians assured them that these were all of the same species as the white bear, that they associated together, had longer nails than the others, and never climbed trees. On the other hand, the blackskins, those that were black with white hairs intermixed or with a white breast, the uniform bay, the brown, and the light reddish-brown, were classed under the name yak-ah, and were said to resemble each other in being smaller and having shorter nails, in climbing trees, and being so little vicious that they could be pursued with safety. Lewis and Clark came to the conclusion that all those with white-tipped hair found by them in the basin of the Columbia belonged to the same species as the grizzlies of the upper Missouri, and that the black and reddish-brown, etc., of the Rocky Mountains belonged to a second species equally distinct from the grizzly and the black bear of the Pacific coast and the east, which never vary in color. As much as possible should be made by the ordinary traveler of these descriptions, for he will be likely to see very little of any species for himself. Not that bears no longer exist here, but because being shy, they keep out of the way. In order to see them and learn their habits, one must go softly and alone, lingering long in the fringing woods on the banks of the salmon streams and in the small openings in the midst of thickets where berries are most abundant. As for rattlesnakes, the other grand dread of town dwellers when they leave beaten roads, there are two, or perhaps three species of them in Oregon, but they are nowhere to be found in great numbers. In western Oregon they are hardly known at all. In all my walks in the Oregon forest I have never met a single specimen, though a few have been seen at long intervals. When the country was first settled by the whites 50 years ago, the elk roamed through the woods and over the plains to the east of the Cascades in immense numbers. Now they are rarely seen except by experienced hunters who know their haunts in the deepest and most inaccessible solitudes in which they have been driven. So majestic an animal forms a tempting mark for the sportsman's rifle. Countless thousands have been killed for mere amusement, and they already seem to be nearing extinction as rapidly as the buffalo. The antelope also is vanishing from the Columbia plains before the farmers and the cattlemen. Whether the moose still lingers in Oregon or Washington, I am unable to say. On the highest mountains of the Cascade Range, the wild goat roams in comparative security, few of his enemies caring to go so far in pursuit and to hunt on ground so high and dangerous. He is a brave, sturdy, shaggy mountaineer of an animal, enjoying the freedom and security of crumbling ridges and overhanging cliffs above the glaciers, oftentimes beyond the reach of the most daring hunter. They seem to be as much at home on the ice and snowfields as on the crags, making their way in flocks from ridge to ridge on the great volcanic mountains by crossing the glaciers that lie between them, traveling in single file, guided by an old, experienced leader, like a party of climbers on the Alps. On these ice journeys they pick their way through networks of crevasses and over bridges of snow with admirable skill, and the mountaineer may seldom do better in such places than to follow their trail, if he can. In the rich alpine gardens and meadows they find abundance of food, venturing sometimes well down in the prairie openings on the edge of the timberline, but holding themselves ever alert and watchful, ready to flee to their highland castles at the faintest alarm. When their summer pastures are buried beneath the winter snows, they make haste to the lower ridges, seeking the wind-beaten crags and slopes, where the snow cannot lie at any great depth, feeding at times on the leaves and twigs of bushes when grass is beyond reach. The wild sheep is another admirable alpine rover, but comparatively rare in the Oregon mountains, choosing rather the drier ridges to the southward on the Cascades and to the eastward among the spurs of the Rocky Mountain chain. Deer give beautiful animation to the forests, harmonizing finely in their color and movements with the gray and brown shafts of the trees and the swaying of the branches, harmonizing finely in their color and movements with the gray and brown shafts of the trees and the swaying of the branches as they stand in groups at rest, or move gracefully and noiselessly over the mossy ground above the edges of beaver meadows and flowery glades, daintily culling the leaves and tips of the mints and aromatic bushes on which they feed. There are three species, the black-tailed, white-tailed, and mule deer, the last being restricted in its range to the open woods and plains to the eastward of the Cascades. They are nowhere very numerous now, killing for food, for hides, or for mere wanton sport, having well-nigh exterminated them in the more accessible regions, while elsewhere they are too often at the mercy of the wolves. Gliding about in their shady forest homes, keeping well out of sight, there is a multitude of sleek, fur-clad animals living and enjoying their clean, beautiful lives. How beautiful and interesting they are is about as difficult for busy mortals to find out as if their homes were beyond sight in the sky. Hence the stories of every wild hunter and trapper are eagerly listened to as being possibly true, or partly so, however thickly clothed in successive folds of exaggeration and fancy. Unsatisfying as these accounts must be, a tourist's frightened rush and scramble through the woods yields far less than the hunter's wildest story, while in writing we can do but little more than to give a few names as they come to mind: beaver, squirrel, coon, fox, marten, fisher, otter, ermine, wildcat. Only this instead of full descriptions of the bright-eyed furry throng, their snug home nests, their fears and fights and loves, how they get their food, rear their young, escape their enemies, and keep themselves warm and well and exquisitely clean through all the pitiless weather. For many years before the settlement of the country, the fur of the beaver brought a high price, and therefore it was pursued with weariless ardor. Not even in the quest for gold has a more ruthless, desperate energy been developed. It was in those early beaver days that the striking class of adventurers called free trappers made their appearance. Bold, enterprising men, eager to make money and inclined to the same time to relish the license of a savage life, would set forth with a few traps and a gun and a hunting knife, content at first to venture only a short distance up the beaver streams nearest to the settlements, and where the Indians were not likely to molest them. There they would set their traps, while the buffalo, antelope, deer, etc., furnished a royal supply of food. In a few months their pack animals would be laden with thousands of dollars' worth of fur. Next season they would venture farther, and again farther, meanwhile growing rapidly wilder, getting acquainted with the Indian tribes, and usually marrying among them. Thenceforward no danger could stay them in their exciting pursuit. Wherever there were beaver they would go, however far or wild. The wilder the better, provided their scalps could be saved. Oftentimes they were compelled to set their traps and visit them by night and lie hid during the day when operating in the neighborhood of hostile Indians. Not then venturing to make a fire or shoot game, they lived on the raw flesh of the beaver, perhaps seasoned with wild cresses or berries. Then, returning to the trading stations, they would spend their hard earnings in a few weeks of dissipation and good time, and go again to the bears and beavers until at length a bullet or arrow would end all. One after another would be missed by some friend or trader at the autumn rendezvous, reported killed by the Indians, and forgotten. Some men of this class have, from superior skill or fortune, escaped every danger, lived to a good old age, and earned fame, and, by their knowledge of the topography of the vast West then unexplored, have been able to render important service to the country. But most of them laid their bones in the wilderness after a few short, keen seasons. So great were the perils that beset them, the average length of the life of a free trapper has been estimated at less than 5 years. From the Columbia waters, beaver and beaver men have almost wholly passed away, and the men once so striking a part of the view have left scarcely the faintest sign of their existence. On the other hand, 1,000 meadows on the mountains tell the story of the beavers, to remain fresh and green for many a century, monuments of their happy, industrious lives. But there is a little airy elfin animal in these woods, and in all the evergreen woods of the Pacific coast, that is more influential and interesting than even the beaver. This is the Douglas squirrel, Sciurus douglasi. Go where you will throughout all these noble forests, you everywhere find this little squirrel the master existence. Though only a few inches long, so intense in his fiery vigor and restlessness, he stirs every grove with wild life, and makes himself more important than the great bears that shuffle through the berry tangles beneath him. Every tree feels the sting of his sharp feet. Nature has made him master forester, and committed the greater part of the coniferous crops to his management. Probably over half of all the ripe cones of the spruces, firs, and pines are cut off and handled by this busy harvester. Most of them are stored away for food through the winter and spring, but a part are pushed into shallow pits and covered loosely, where some of the seeds are no doubt left to germinate and grow up. All the tree squirrels are more or less bird-like in voice and movements, but the Douglas is preeminently so, possessing every squirrelish attribute, fully developed and concentrated. He is the squirrel of squirrels, flashing from branch to branch of his favorite evergreens, crisp and glossy and sound as a sunbeam. He stirs the leaves like a rustling breeze, darting across openings in arrowy lines, launching in curves, glinting deftly from side to side in sudden zigzags, and swirling in giddy loops and spirals around the trunks, now on his haunches, now on his head, yet ever graceful and performing all his feats of strength and skill without apparent effort. One never tires of this bright spark of life, the brave little voice crying in the wilderness. His varied, piney gossip is as savory to the air as balsam to the palate. Some of his notes are almost flute-like in softness, while other prick and tingle like thistles. He is the mockingbird of squirrels, barking like a dog, screaming like a hawk, whistling like a blackbird or linnet, while in bluff, audacious noisiness he is a jay, a small thing, but filling and animating all the woods. Nor is there any lack of wings, notwithstanding few are to be seen on short, noisy rambles. The ouzel sweetens the shady glens and canyons where waterfalls abound, and every grove or forest, however silent it may seem when we chance to pay it a hasty visit, has its singers, thrushes, linnets, warblers, while hummingbirds glint and hover above the fringing masses of bloom around stream and meadow openings. But few of these will show themselves or sing their songs to those who are ever in haste and getting lost, going in gangs formidable in color and accoutrements, laughing, hallooing, breaking limbs off the trees as they pass, awkwardly struggling through briery thickets, entangled like blue bottles in spider webs, and stopping from time to fire off their guns and pistols for the sake of the echoes, thus frightening all the life about them for miles. It is this class of hunters and travelers who report that there are no birds in the woods or game animals of any kind larger than mosquitoes. Besides the singing birds mentioned above, the handsome Oregon grouse may be found in the thick woods, also the dusky grouse and Franklin's grouse, and in some places the beautiful mountain partridge or quail. The white-tailed ptarmigan lives on the lofty snow peaks above the timber, and the prairie chicken and sage-cock on the broad Columbia plains from the Cascade Range back to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The bald eagle is very common along the Columbia River, or wherever fish, especially salmon, are plentiful, while swans, herons, cranes, pelicans, geese, ducks of many species, and water birds in general abound in the lake region, on the main streams, and along the coast, stirring the waters and sky into fine, lively pictures, greatly to the delight of wandering lovers of wildness. End of Chapter 22. The Forests of Oregon and Their Inhabitants. Chapter 23 of Steep Trails. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Dennison. Steep Trails by John Muir. Turning from the woods and their inhabitants to the rivers, we find that while the former are rarely seen by travelers beyond the immediate borders of the settlements, the great river of Oregon draws crowds of enthusiastic admirers to sound its praises. Every summer since the completion of the first overland railroad, tourists have been coming to it in ever-increasing numbers, showing that in general estimation the Columbia is one of the chief attractions of the Pacific Coast, and well it deserves the admiration so heartily bestowed upon it. The beauty and majesty of its waters and the variety and grandeur of the scenery through which it flows lead many to regard it as the most interesting of all the great rivers of the continent, notwithstanding the claims of the other members of the family to which it belongs and which nobody can measure, the Fraser, Mackenzie, Saskatchewan, the Missouri, Yellowstone, Platte, and the Colorado, with their glacier and geyser fountains, their famous canyons, lakes, forests, and vast flowery prairies and plains. These great rivers and the Columbia are intimately related. All draw their upper waters from the same high fountains on the broad, rugged uplift of the Rocky Mountains, their branches interlacing like the branches of trees. They sing their first songs together on the heights, then, collecting their tributaries, they set out on their grand journey to the Atlantic, Pacific, or Arctic Ocean. The Columbia, viewed as one from the sea to the mountains, is like a rugged, broad-topped, picturesque old oak, about 600 miles long and nearly 1,000 miles wide measured across the spread of its upper branches, the main limbs gnarled and swollen with lakes and lake-like expansions, while innumerable smaller lakes shine like fruit among the smaller branches. The main trunk extends back through the coast and Cascade Mountains in a general easterly direction for 300 miles, when it divides abruptly into two grand branches which bend off to the northeastward and southeastward. The south branch, the longer of the two, called the Snake or Lewis River, extends into the Rocky Mountains as far as the Yellowstone National Park, where its head tributaries interlace with those of the Colorado, Missouri, and Yellowstone. The north branch, still called the Columbia, extends through Washington far into British territory, its highest tributaries reaching back through long parallel spurs of the Rockies, between and beyond the headwaters of the Fraser Athabasca, and Saskatchewan. Each of these main branches, dividing again and again, spreads a network of channels over the vast complicated mass of the Great Range throughout a section nearly 1,000 miles in length, searching every fountain, however small or great, and gathering a glorious harvest of crystal water to be rolled through forest and plain in one majestic flood to the sea, reinforced on the way by tributaries that drain the Blue Mountains and more than 200 miles of the Cascade and Coast Ranges. Though less than half as long as the Mississippi, it is said to carry as much water. The amount of its discharge at different seasons, however, has never been exactly measured, but in time of flood its current is sufficiently massive and powerful to penetrate the sea to a distance of 50 or 60 miles from shore, its waters being easily recognized by the difference in color and by the drift of leaves, berries, pine cones, branches, and trunks of trees that they carry. That so large a river as the Columbia, making a telling current so far from shore, should remain undiscovered while one exploring expedition after another sailed past seems remarkable, even after due allowance is made for the cloudy weather that prevails hereabouts and the broad fence of breakers drawn across the bar. During the last few centuries, when the maps of the world were in great part blank, the search for new worlds was fashionable business, and when such large game was no longer to be found, islands lying unclaimed in the great oceans, inhabited by useful and profitable people, to be converted or enslaved, became attractive objects. Also new ways to India, seas, straits, El Dorados, fountains of youth, and rivers that flowed over golden sands. Those early explorers and adventurers were mostly brave, enterprising, and, after their fashion, pious men. In their clumsy sailing vessels they dared to go where no chart or lighthouse showed the way, where the set of the currents, the location of sunken outlying rocks and shoals were all unknown, facing fate and weather, undaunted however dark the signs, heaving the lead and thrashing the men to their duty and trusting to Providence. When a new shore was found on which they could land, they said their prayers with superb audacity, fought the natives if they cared to fight, erected crosses, and took possession in the names of their sovereigns, establishing claims, such as they were, to everything in sight and beyond, to be quarreled for and battled for, and passed from hand to hand in treaties and settlements made during the intermissions of war. The branch of the river that bears the name of Columbia, all the way to its head, takes its rise in two lakes about 10 miles in length that lie between the Selkirk and Main ranges of the Rocky Mountains in British Columbia, about 80 miles beyond the boundary line. They are called the Upper and Lower Columbia Lakes. Issuing from these, the young river holds a nearly straight course for 170 miles in a northwesterly direction to a plain called Boat Encampment, receiving many beautiful affluents by the way from the Selkirk and Main ranges, among which are the Beaverfoot, Blackberry, Spillimicini, and Gold rivers. At Boat Encampment it receives two large tributaries, the Canoe River from the northwest, a stream about 120 miles long, and the Whirlpool River from the north, about 140 miles in length. The Whirlpool River takes its rise near the summit of the main axis of the range on the 54th parallel and is the northmost of all the Columbia waters. About 30 miles above its confluence with the Columbia, it flows through a lake called the Punch Bowl, and thence it passes between Mounts Hooker and Brown, said to be 15,000 and 16,000 feet high, making magnificent scenery, though the height of the mountains thereabouts has been considerably overestimated. From Boat Encampment, the river, now a large clear stream, said to be nearly a third of a mile in width, doubles back on its original course and flows southward as far as its confluence with the Spokane in Washington, a distance of nearly 300 miles in a direct line, most of the way through a wild, rocky, picturesque mass of mountains, charmingly forested with pine and spruce, though the trees seem strangely small, like second-growth saplings to one familiar with the western forests of Washington, Oregon, and California. About 45 miles below Boat Encampment are the Upper Dalles, or Dalles du Nord, and 30 miles farther the Lower Dalles, where the river makes a magnificent uproar and interrupts navigation. About 30 miles below the Lower Dalles, the river expands into Upper Arrow Lake, a beautiful sheet of water 40 miles long and 5 miles wide, straight as an arrow, and with the beautiful forests of the Selkirk Range rising from its east shore, and those of the Gold Range from the west. At the foot of the lake are the Narrows, a few miles in length, and after these rapids are passed, the river enters Lower Arrow Lake, which is like the Upper Arrow, but is even longer and not so straight. A short distance below the Lower Arrow, the Columbia receives the Kootenay River, the largest affluent thus far on its course, and said to be navigable for small steamers for 150 miles. It is an exceedingly crooked stream, heading beyond the upper Columbia Lakes, and, in its mazy course, flowing to all points of the compass, it seems lost and baffled in the tangle of mountain spurs and ridges it drains. Measured around its loops and bends, it is probably more than 500 miles in length. It is also rich in lakes, the largest, Kootenay Lake, being upwards of 70 miles in length and an average width of 5 miles. A short distance below the confluence of the Kootenay, near the boundary line between Washington and British Columbia, another large stream comes in from the east, Clark's Fork, or the Flathead River. Its upper sources are near those of the Missouri and South Saskatchewan, and in its course it flows through two large and beautiful lakes, the Flathead and the Pont d'Oreille. All the lakes we have noticed thus far would make charming places of summer resort, but Pont d'Oreille, besides being surpassingly beautiful, has the advantage of being easily accessible, since it is on the main line of the Northern Pacific Railroad in the territory of Idaho. In the purity of its waters it reminds one of Tahoe, while its many picturesque islands crowned with evergreens and its winding shores forming an endless variety of bays and promontories, lavishly crowded with spiry spruce and cedar, recall some of the best of the island scenery of Alaska. About 35 miles below the mouth of Clark's Fork, the Columbia is joined by the Nihuialpitku River from the northwest. Here, too, are the great Chaudiere, or Kettle, Falls on the main river, with a total descent of about 50 feet. 50 miles farther down, the Spokane River, a clear, dashing stream, comes in from the east. It is about 120 miles long and takes its rise in the beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in Idaho, which receives the drainage of nearly 100 miles of the western slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains through the St. Joseph and Coeur d'Alene rivers. The lake is about 20 miles long, set in the midst of charming scenery, and, like Pont d'Oreille, is easy of access and is already attracting attention as a summer place for enjoyment, rest, and health. The famous Spokane Falls are in Washington, about 30 miles below the lake, where the river is outspread and divided and makes a grand descent from a level basaltic plateau, giving rise to one of the most beautiful as well as one of the greatest and most available of water powers in the state. The city of the same name is built on the plateau along both sides of the series of cascades and falls, which, rushing and sounding through the midst, gives singular beauty and animation. The young city is also rushing and booming. It's founded on a rock, leveled and prepared for it, and its streets require no grading or paving. As a power to whirl the machinery of a great city, and at the same time to train the people to a love of the sublime and beautiful as displayed in living water, the Spokane Falls are unrivaled, at least as far as my observation has reached. Nowhere else have I seen such lessons given by a river in the streets of a city, such a glad, exulting, abounding outgush, crisp and clear from the mountains, dividing, falling, displaying its wealth, calling aloud in the midst of the busy throng, and making glorious offerings for every use of utility or adornment. From the mouth of the Spokane, the Columbia, now out of the woods, flows to the westward with a broad, stately current for 120 miles to receive the Okanagan, a large, generous tributary 160 miles long, coming from the north and drawing some of its waters from the Cascade Range. More than half its course is through a chain of lakes, the largest of which, at the head of the river, is over 60 miles in length. From its confluence with the Okanagan, the river pursues a southerly course for 150 miles, most of the way through a dreary, treeless, parched plain to meet the Great South Fork. The Lewis, or Snake River, is nearly 1,000 miles long and drains nearly the whole of Idaho, a territory rich in scenery, gold mines, flowery, grassy valleys, and deserts, while some of the highest tributaries reach into Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. Throughout a great part of its course it is countersunk in a black lava plain and shut in by mural precipices 1,000 feet high, gloomy, forbidding, and unapproachable, although the gloominess of its canyon is relieved in some manner by its many falls and springs, some of the springs being large enough to appear as the outlets of subterranean rivers. They gush out from the faces of the sheer black walls and descend foaming with brave roar and beauty to swell the flood below. From where the river skirts the base of the Blue Mountains, its surroundings are less forbidding. Much of the country is fertile, but its canyon is everywhere deep and almost inaccessible. Steamers make their way up as far as Lewiston, 150 miles, and receive cargoes of wheat at different points through chutes that extend down from the tops of the bluffs. But though the Hudson's Bay Company navigated the North Fork to its sources, they depend altogether on pack animals for the transportation of supplies and furs between the Columbia and Fort Hall on the head of the South Fork, which shows how desperately unmanageable a river it must be. A few miles above the mouth of the Snake, the Yakima, which drains a considerable portion of the Cascade Range, enters from the northwest. It is about 150 miles long, but carries comparatively little water, a great part of what it sets out with from the base of the mountains being consumed in irrigated fields and meadows in passing through the settlements along its course, and by evaporation on the parched desert plains. The grand flood of the Columbia, now from half a mile to a mile wide, sweeps on to the westward, holding a nearly direct course until it reaches the mouth of the Willamette, where it turns to the northward and flows 50 miles along the main valley between the Coast and Cascade Ranges, ere it again resumes its westward course to the sea. In all its course from the mouth of the Yakima to the sea, a distance of 300 miles, the only considerable affluent from the northward is the Cowlitz, which heads in the glaciers of Mount Rainier. From the south and east it receives the Walla Walla and Umatilla, rather short and dreary-looking streams, though the plains they pass through have proved fertile, and their upper tributaries in the Blue Mountains, shaded with tall pines, firs, spruces, and the beautiful Oregon larch, Larix brevifolia, lead into a delightful region. The John Day River also heads in the Blue Mountains and flows into the Columbia 60 miles below the mouth of the Umatilla. Its valley is in great part fertile, and is noted for the interesting fossils discovered in it by Professor Condon in sections cut by the river through the overlying lava beds. The Deschutes River comes in from the south, about 20 miles below the John Day. It is a large, boisterous stream, draining the eastern slope of the Cascade Range for nearly 200 miles, and from the great number of falls on the main trunk, as well as on its many mountain tributaries, well deserves its name. It enters the Columbia with a grand roar of falls and rapids, and at times seems almost to rival the main stream in the volume of water it carries. Near the mouth of the Deschutes are the Falls of the Columbia, where the river passes a rough bar of lava. The descent is not great, but the immense volume of water makes a grand display. During the flood season, the falls are obliterated and skillful boatmen pass over them in safety, while the Dalles, some 6 or 8 miles below, may be passed during low water but are utterly impassable in flood time. At the Dalles the vast river is jammed together into a long, narrow slot of unknown depth cut sheer down in the basalt. This slot, or trough, is about 1.5 miles long and about 60 yards wide at the narrowest place. At ordinary times, the river seems to be set on edge and runs swiftly but without much noisy surging, with a descent of about 20 feet to the mile. But when the snow is melting on the mountains, the river rises here 60 feet, or even more during extraordinary freshets, and spreads out over a great breadth of massive rocks through which have been cut several other gorges running parallel with the one usually occupied. All these inferior gorges now come into use, and the huge roaring torrent, still rising and spreading, at length overwhelms the high jagged rock walls between them, making a tremendous display of chafing, surging, shattered currents, countercurrents, and hollowed whirls that no words can be made to describe. A few miles below the Dalles, the storm-tossed river gets itself together again, looks like water, becomes silent, and with stately, tranquil deliberation goes on its way, out of the gray region of sage and sand into the Oregon woods. 35 or 40 miles below the Dalles are the Cascades of the Columbia, where the river in passing through the mountains makes another magnificent display of foaming, surging rapids, which form the first obstruction to navigation from the ocean, 120 miles distant. This obstruction is to be overcome by locks which are now being made. Between the Dalles and the Cascades, the river is like a lake a mile or two wide, lying in a valley or canyon about 3,000 feet deep. The walls of the canyon lean well back in most places and leave here and there small strips or bays of level ground along the water's edge. But towards the Cascades, and for some distance below, the immediate banks are guarded by walls of columnar basalt, which are worn in many places into a great variety of bold and picturesque forms, such as the Castle Rock, the Rooster Rock, the Pillars of Hercules, Cape Horn, etc., while back of these rise the sublime mountain walls, forest-crowned and fringed more or less from top to base with pine, spruce, and shaggy underbrush, especially in the narrow gorges and ravines, where innumerable small streams come dancing and drifting down, misty and white, to join the mighty river. Many of these falls on both sides of the Canyon of the Columbia are far larger and more interesting in every way than would be guessed from the slight glimpses one gets of them while sailing past on the river, or from the car windows. The Multnomah Falls are particularly interesting and occupy fern-lined gorges of marvelous beauty in the basalt. They are said to be about 800 feet in height, and at times of high water when the mountain snows are melting, are well worthy of a place beside the famous falls of Yosemite Valley. According to an Indian tradition, the river of the Cascades once flowed through the basalt beneath a natural bridge that was broken down during a mountain war, when the old volcanoes, Hood and St. Helens, on opposite sides of the river, hurled rocks at each other, thus forming a dam. That the river has been dammed here to some extent, and within a comparatively short time, seems probable, to say the least, since great numbers of submerged trees standing erect may be found along both shores, while, as we have seen, the whole river for 30 miles above the Cascades looks like a lake or mill pond. On the other hand, it is held by some that the submerged groves were carried into their places by immense landslides. Much of interest in the connection must necessarily be omitted for want of space. About 40 miles below the Cascades, the river receives the Willamette, the last of its great tributaries. It is navigable for ocean vessels as far as Portland, 10 miles above its mouth, and for river steamers 100 miles farther. The falls of the Willamette are 15 miles above Portland, where the river, coming out of dense woods, breaks its way across a bar of black basalt and falls 40 feet in a passion of snowy foam, showing to fine advantage against its background of evergreens. Of the fertility and beauty of the Willamette, all the world has heard. It lies between the Cascade and Coast Ranges and is bound on the south by the Kalapuya Mountains, a cross-spur that separates it from the valley of the Umpqua. It was here the first settlements for agriculture were made and a provisional government organized, while the settlers, isolated in the far wilderness, numbered only a few thousand and were laboring under the opposition of the British government and the Hudson's Bay Company. Eager desire in the acquisition of territory on the part of these pioneer state builders was more truly boundless than the wilderness they were in, and their unconscionable patriotism was equaled only by their belligerents. For here, while negotiations were pending for the location of the northern boundary, originated the celebrated 5440 or fight, about as reasonable a war cry as the North Pole or fight. Yet sad was the day that brought the news of the signing of the treaty fixing their boundary along the 49th parallel, thus leaving the little land-hungry settlement only a mere 250,000 of miles. As the Willamette is one of the most foodful of valleys, so is the Columbia one of the most foodful of rivers. During the fishers' harvest time, salmon from the sea come in countless millions, urging their way against falls, rapids, and shallows up into the very heart of the Rocky Mountains, supplying everybody by the way with most bountiful masses of delicious food, weighing from 20 to 80 pounds each, plump and smooth like loaves of bread ready for the oven. The supply seems inexhaustible, as well it might. Large quantities were used by the Indians as fuel, and by the Hudson's Bay people as manure for their gardens at the forts. Used, wasted, canned, and sent in shiploads to all the world, a grand harvest was reaped every year while nobody sowed. Of late, however, the salmon crop has begun to fail, and millions of young fry are now sown like wheat in the river every year, from hatching establishments belonging to the government. All of the Oregon waters that win their way to the sea are a tributary to the Columbia, save the short streams of the immediate coast and the Umpqua and Rogue rivers in southern Oregon, These both head in the Cascade Mountains and find their way to the sea through gaps in the Coast Range, and both drain large and fertile and beautiful valleys. Rogue River Valley is peculiarly attractive. With a fine climate and kindly, productive soil, the scenery is delightful. About the main, central open portion of the basin, dotted with picturesque groves of oak, there are many smaller valleys charmingly environed, the whole surrounded in the distance by the Siskiyou, Coast, Umpqua, and Cascade Mountains. Besides the cereals, nearly every sort of fruit flourishes here, and large areas are being devoted to peach, apricot, nectarine, and vine culture. To me, it seems above all others the Garden Valley of Oregon and the most delightful place for a home. On the eastern rim of the valley, in the Cascade Mountains, about 60 miles from Medford in a direct line, is the remarkable Crater Lake, usually regarded as one grand wonder of the region. It lies in a deep, sheer-walled basin about 7,000 feet above the level of the sea, supposed to be the crater of an extinct volcano. Oregon, as it is today, is a very young country, though most of it seems old. Contemplating the Columbia sweeping from forest to forest, across plain and desert, one is led to say of it, as did Byron of the ocean, "Such as creation's dawn beheld, thou rollest now." How ancient appear the crumbling basaltic monuments along its banks, and the gray plains to the east of the Cascades! Nevertheless, the river as well as its basin in anything like their present condition are comparatively but of yesterday. Looming no further back in the geological records than the Tertiary period, the Oregon of that time looks altogether strange in the few suggestive glimpses we may get of it. Forests in which palm trees wave their royal crowns, and strange animals roaming beneath them or about the reedy margins of lakes, the Oreodon, the Lophiodon, and several extinct species of the horse and camel and other animals. Then came the fire period, with its darkening showers of ashes and cinders, and its vast floods of molten lava, making quite another Oregon from the fair and fertile land of the preceding era. And again, while yet the volcanic fires show signs of action in the smoke and flame of the higher mountains, the whole region passes under the dominion of ice, and from the frost and darkness and death of the glacial period, Oregon has but recently emerged to the kindly warmth and life of today. End of chapter 23. Recording by John Dennison, Portland, Maine.
Chapter 24, Part 1 of Steep Trails. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Steep Trails by John Muir. Chapter 24, Part 1. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado. Happy nowadays is the tourist, with earth's wonders, new and old, spread invitingly open before him, and a host of able workers as his slaves, making everything easy, padding plush about him, grading roads for him, boring tunnels, moving hills out of his way, eager, like the devil, to show him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory and foolishness, spiritualizing travel for him with lightning and steam, abolishing space and time, and almost everything else. Little children and tender, pulpy people, as well as storm-seasoned explorers, may now go almost everywhere in smooth comfort, cross oceans and deserts, scarce accessible to fishes and birds, and, dragged by steel horses, go up high mountains, riding gloriously beneath starry showers of sparks, ascending like Elijah in a whirlwind and chariot of fire. First of the wonders of the Great West to be brought within reach of the tourist were the Yosemite and the Big Trees, on the completion of the first transcontinental railway. Next came the Yellowstone and icy Alaska by the northern roads, And last, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado, which, naturally the hardest to reach, has now become, by a branch of the Santa Fe, the most accessible of all. Of course, with this wonderful extension of steel ways through our wilderness, there is loss as well as gain. Nearly all railroads are bordered by belts of desolation. The finest wilderness perishes as if stricken with pestilence. Bird and beast people, if not the dryads, are frightened from the groves. Too often the groves also vanish, leaving nothing but ashes. Fortunately, nature has a few big places beyond man's power to spoil: the ocean, the two icy ends of the globe, and the Grand Canyon. When I first heard of the Santa Fe trains running to the edge of the Grand Canyon of Arizona, I was troubled with thoughts of the disenchantment likely to follow. But last winter, when I saw those trains crawling along through the pines of the Coconino forest, and close up to the brink of the chasm at Bright Angel, I was glad to discover that in the presence of such stupendous scenery they are nothing. The locomotives and trains are mere beetles and caterpillars, and the noise they make is as little disturbing as the hooting of an owl in the lonely woods. In a dry, hot, monotonous, forested plateau, seemingly boundless, you come suddenly and without warning upon the abrupt edge of a gigantic sunken landscape of the wildest, most multitudinous features, and those features, sharp and angular, are made out of flat beds of limestone and sandstone, forming a spiry, jagged, gloriously colored mountain range countersunk in a level gray plain. It is a hard job to sketch it even in scrawniest outline, and try as I may, not in the least sparing myself, I cannot tell the hundredth part of the wonders of its features. The side canyons, gorges, alcoves, cloisters, and amphitheaters of vast sweep and depth, carved in its magnificent walls. The throng of great architectural rocks it contains, resembling castles, cathedrals, temples, and palaces, towered and spired and painted, some of them nearly a mile high, yet beneath one's feet. All this, however, is less difficult than to give any idea of the impression of wild, primeval beauty and power one receives in merely gazing from its brink. The view down the gulf of color and over the rim of its wonderful wall, more than any other view I know, leads us to think of our earth as a star, with stars swimming in light, every radiant spire pointing the way to the heavens. But it is impossible to conceive what the Grand Canyon is, or what impression it makes from descriptions or pictures, however good. Naturally, it is untellable, even to those who have seen something perhaps a little like it on a small scale in this same plateau region. One's most extravagant expectations are indefinitely surpassed, though one expects much from what is said of it as the biggest chasm on earth. So big is it that all other big things, Yosemite, the Yellowstone, the pyramids, Chicago, all would be lost if tumbled into it. Naturally enough, illustrations as to size are sought for among other canyons like or unlike it, with the common result of worse confounding confusion. The prudent keep silence. It was once said that the Grand Canyon could put a dozen Yosemites in its vest pocket. The justly famous Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone is, like the Colorado, gorgeously colored and abruptly countersunk in a plateau, and both are mainly the work of water. But the Colorado's canyon is more than 1,000 times larger, and as a score or two of new buildings of ordinary size would not appreciably change the general view of a great city, so hundreds of Yellowstones might be eroded in the sides of the Colorado Canyon without noticeably augmenting its size or the richness of its sculpture. But it is not true that the great Yosemite rocks would be thus lost or hidden. Nothing of their kind in the world, so far as I know, rivals El Capitan and TriciaG, much less dwarfs or in any way belittles them. None of the sandstone or limestone precipices of the canyon that I have seen or heard of approaches in smooth, flawless strength and grandeur the granite face of El Capitan or the Tenaya side of Cloud's Rest. These colossal cliffs, types of permanence, are about 3,000 and 6,000 feet high. Those of the canyon that are sheer are about half as high, and are types of fleeting change, while glorious domed TriciaG, noblest of mountain buildings, far from being overshadowed or lost in this rosy, spiry canyon company, would draw every eye, and in serene majesty, abundama, she would take her place, castle, temple, palace, or tower. Nevertheless, a noted writer, comparing the Grand Canyon in a general way with the glacial Yosemite, says, quote, "And the Yosemite, ah, the lovely Yosemite, dumped down into the wilderness of gorges and mountains. It would take a guide who knew of its existence a long time to find it." Close quote. This is striking, and shows up well above the levels of commonplace description, but it is confusing, and has the fatal fault of not being true. As well try to describe an eagle by putting a lark in it. Quote, "And the lark, ah, the lovely lark, dumped down the red royal gorge of the eagle, it would be hard to find." Close quote. Each in its own place is better, singing at heaven's gate, and sailing the sky with the clouds. Every feature of nature's big face is beautiful, height and hollow, wrinkle, furrow, and line, and this is the main master furrow of its kind on our continent, incomparably greater and more impressive than any other yet discovered, or likely to be discovered, now that all the great rivers have been traced to their heads. The Colorado River rises in the heart of the continent, on the dividing ranges and ridges between the two oceans, drains thousands of snowy mountains through narrow or spacious valleys, and thence through canyons of every color, sheer-walled and deep, all of which seem to be represented in this one grand canyon of canyons. It is very hard to give anything like an adequate conception of its size, much more of its color, its vast wall sculpture, the wealth of ornate architectural buildings that fill it, or, most of all, the tremendous impression it makes. According to Major Powell, it is about 217 miles long, from 5 to 15 miles wide from rim to rim, and from about 5,000 to 6,000 feet deep. So tremendous a chasm would be one of the world's greatest wonders, even if, like ordinary canyons cut in sedimentary rocks, it were empty and its walls were simple. But instead of being plain, the walls are so deeply and elaborately carved into all sorts of recesses, alcoves, cirques, amphitheaters, and side canyons, that Were you to trace the rim closely around on both sides, your journey would be nearly 1,000 miles long. Into all these recesses the level, continuous beds of rock in ledges and benches with their various colors run like broad ribbons, marvelously beautiful and effective even at a distance of 10 or 12 miles. And the vast space these glorious walls enclose, instead of being empty, is crowded with gigantic architectural rock forms, gorgeously colored and adorned with towers and spires like works of art. Looking down from this level plateau, we are more impressed with a feeling of being on the top of everything than when looking from the summit of a mountain. From side to side of the vast gulf, temples, palaces, towers, and spires come soaring up in thick array, half a mile or nearly a mile above their sunken, hidden bases, some to a level with our standpoint, but none higher. And in the inspiring morning light all are so fresh and rosy-looking that they seem new-born, as if, like the quick-growing crimson snow-plants of the California woods, they had just sprung up, hatched by the warm, brooding, motherly weather. In trying to describe the great pines and sequoias of the Sierra, I have often thought that if one of these trees could be set by itself in some city park, its grandeur might there be impressively realized, while in its home forests, where all magnitudes are great, the weary, satiated traveler sees none of them truly. It is so with these majestic rock structures. Though mere residual masses of the plateau, they are dowered with the grandeur and repose of mountains, together with the finely chiseled carving and modeling of man's temples and palaces, and often, to a considerable extent, with their symmetry. Some, closely observed, look like ruins, but even these stand plumb and true, and show architectural forms loaded with lines strictly regular and decorative, and all are arrayed in colors that storms and time seem only to brighten. They are not placed in regular rows in line with the river, but "athrough ither," as the Scotch say, in lavish, exuberant crowds, as if nature in wildest extravagance held her bravest structures as common as gravel piles. Yonder stands a spiry cathedral nearly 5,000 feet in height, nobly symmetrical, with sheer buttressed walls and arched doors and windows, as richly finished and decorated with sculptures as the great rock temples of India or Egypt. Beside it rises a huge castle with arched gateway, turrets, watchtowers, ramparts, etc., and to the right and left palaces, obelisks, and pyramids fairly fill the gulf, all colossal and all lavishly painted and carved. Here and there a flat-topped structure may be seen, or one imperfectly domed, but the prevailing style is ornate Gothic, with many hints of Egyptian and Indian. Throughout this vast extent of wild architecture, nature's own capital city, there seem to be no ordinary dwellings. All look like grand and important public structures, except perhaps some of the lower pyramids, broad-based and sharp-pointed, covered with down-flowing talus, like loosely set tents with hollow, sagging sides. The roofs often have disintegrated rocks heaped and dragged over them, but in the main the masonry is firm and laid in regular courses, as if done by square and rule. Nevertheless, they are ever changing. Their tops are now a dome, now a flat table, or a spire, as harder or softer strata are reached in their slow degradation, while the sides, with all their fine moldings, are being steadily undermined and eaten away. But no essential change in style or color is thus effected. From century to century they stand the same. What seems confusion among the rough, earthquake-shaken crags nearest one comes to order as soon as the main plan of the various structures appears. Every building, however complicated and laden with ornamental lines, is at one with itself and every one of its neighbors, for the same characteristic controlling belts of color and solid strata extend with wonderful constancy for very great distances, and pass through and give style to thousands of separate structures, however their smaller characters may vary. Of all the various kinds of ornamental work displayed, carving, tracery on cliff faces, moldings, arches, pinnacles, none is more admirably effective or charms more than the webs of rain-channeled taluses, marvelously extensive, without the slightest appearance of waste or excess. They cover roofs and dome tops, and the base of every cliff, belt each spire and pyramid and massy towering temple, and in beautiful continuous lines go sweeping along the great walls, in and out around all the intricate system of side canyons, amphitheaters, cirques, and scallops into which they are sculptured. From one point hundreds of miles of the fairy embroidery may be traced. It is all so fine and orderly that it would seem that not only had the clouds and streams been kept harmoniously busy in the making of it, but that every raindrop, sent like a bullet to a mark, had been the subject of a separate thought. So sure is the outcome of beauty through the stormy centuries. Surely nowhere else are there illustrations so striking of the natural beauty of desolation and death, so many of nature's own mountain buildings wasting in glory of high desert air, going to dust. See how steadfast in beauty they all are in their going. Look again, and again, how the rough, dusty boulders and sand of disintegration from the upper ledges wreathe in beauty for ashes, as in the flowers of a prairie after fires. But here the very dust and ashes are beautiful. Gazing across the chasm, we at last discover that it is not its great depth nor length, nor yet these wonderful buildings that most impresses us. It is its immense width, sharply defined by precipitous walls plunging suddenly down from a flat plain, declaring in terms instantly apprehended that the vast gulf is a gash in the once unbroken plateau made by slow, orderly erosion and removal of huge beds of rocks. Other valleys of erosion are as great, in all their dimensions some are greater, but none of these produces an effect on the imagination at once so quick and profound, coming without study, given at a glance. Therefore, by far the greatest and most influential feature of this view from Bright Angel or any other of the cañon views is the opposite wall. Of the one beneath our feet, we see only fragmentary sections in cirques and amphitheaters and on the sides of the out-jutting promontories between them, while the other, though far distant, is beheld in all its glory of color and noble proportions, the one supreme beauty and wonder to which the eye is ever turning. For while charming with its beauty, it tells the story of the stupendous erosion of the cañon, the foundation of the unspeakable impression made on everybody. It seems a gigantic statement for even nature to make, all in one mighty stone word, apprehended at once like a burst of light, celestial color its natural vesture, coming in glory to mind and heart as to a home prepared for it from the very beginning. Wildness so godful, cosmic, primeval, bestows a new sense of earth's beauty and size. Not even from high mountains does the world seem so wide, so like a star in glory of light on its way through the heavens. I have observed scenery hunters of all sorts getting first views of Yosemites, glaciers, white mountain ranges, etc. Mixed with the enthusiasm which such scenery naturally excites, there is often weak gushing, and many sputter aloud like little waterfalls. Here, for a moment at least, there is silence, and all are in dead earnest, as if awed and hushed by an earthquake, perhaps until the cook cries, "Breakfast," or the stable boy, "Horses are ready," and then the poor unfortunates, slaves of regular habits, turn quickly away, gasping and muttering as if wondering where they had been and what had enchanted them. Roads have been made from Bright Angel Hotel through the Coconino Forest to the ends of outstanding promontories, commanding extensive views up and down the cañon. The nearest of them, 3 or 4 miles east and west, are O'Neill's Point and Rose Point. The latter, besides commanding the eternally interesting cañon, gives wide, sweeping views southeast and west over the dark forest roof to the San Francisco and Mount Trumbull volcanoes, the bluest of mountains over the blackest of level woods. Instead of thus riding in dust with the crowd, more will be gained by going quietly afoot along the rim at different times of day and night, free to observe the vegetation, the fossils in the rocks, the seams beneath overhanging ledges once inhabited by Indians, and to watch the stupendous scenery in the changing lights and shadows, clouds, showers, and storms. One need not go hunting the so-called points of interest. The verge, anywhere, everywhere, is a point of interest beyond one's wildest dreams. As yet, few of the promontories or throng of mountain buildings in the cañon are named, nor among such exuberance of forms are names thought of by the bewildered, hurried tourist. He would be as likely to think of names for waves in a storm. The eastern and western cloisters, Hindu Amphitheater, Cape Royal, Powell's Plateau, Grand Viewpoint, Point Sublime, Bissell and Moran Points, the Temple of Set, Vishnu's Temple, Shiva's Temple, Twin Temples, Tower of Babel, Hance's Column. These fairly good names given by Dutton, Holmes, Morand, and others are scattered over a large stretch of the cañon wilderness. All the cañon rock beds are lavishly painted, except a few neutral bars and the granite notch at the bottom occupied by the river, which makes but little sign. It is a vast wilderness of rocks in a sea of light, colored and glowing like oak and maple woods in autumn when the sun gold is richest. I have just said that it is impossible to learn what the canyon is like from descriptions and pictures. Powell's and Dutton's descriptions present magnificent views not only of the canyon but of all the grand region round about it, and Holmes' drawings accompanying Dutton's report are wonderfully good. Surely faithful and loving skill can go no farther in putting the multitudinous decorated forms on paper. But the colors, the living, rejoicing colors, chanting morning and evening in chorus to heaven, whose brush or pencil, however lovingly inspired, can give us these? And if paint is of no effect, what hope lies in pen work? Only this: some may be incited by it to go and see for themselves. No other range of mountainous rock work of anything like the same extent have I seen that is so strangely, boldly, lavishly colored. The famous Yellowstone Canyon below the falls comes to mind, but wonderful as it is, and well deserved as is its fame, compared with this, it is only a bright rainbow ribbon at the roots of the pines. Each of the series of level, continuous beds of carboniferous rocks of the canyon has, as we have seen, its own characteristic color. The summit limestone beds are pale yellow. Next below these are the beautiful rose-colored, cross-bedded sandstones. Next there are 1,000 feet of brilliant red sandstones, and below these the red wall limestones, over 2,000 feet thick, rich, massy red, the greatest and most influential of the series, and forming the main color fountain. Between these are many neutral tinted beds. The prevailing colors are wonderfully deep and clear, changing and blending with varying intensity from hour to hour, day to day, season to season, throbbing, wavering, glowing, responding to every passing cloud or storm, a world of color in itself, now burning in separate rainbow bars streaked and blotched with shade, now glowing in one smooth, all-pervading, ethereal radiance like the alpenglow, uniting the rocky world with the heavens. The dawn, as in all the pure, dry desert country, is ineffably beautiful, and when the first level sunbeams sting the domes and spires, with what a burst of power the big, wild days begin. The dead and the living, rocks and hearts alike, awake and sing the new old song of creation. All the massy headlands and salient angles of the walls, and the multitudinous temples and palaces, seem to catch the light at once and cast thick black shadows athwart hollow and gorge, bringing out details as well as the massive features of the architecture, while all the rocks, as if wild with life, throb and quiver and glow in the glorious sunburst, rejoicing. Every rock temple then becomes a temple of music, every spire and pinnacle an angel of light and song, shouting color hallelujahs. As the day draws to a close, shadows, wondrous black and thick like those of the morning, fill up the wall hollows, while the glowing rocks, their rough angles burned off, seem soft and hot to the heart as they stand submerged in purple haze, which now fills the canyon like a sea. Still deeper, richer, more divine grow the great walls and temples, until in the supreme flaming glory of sunset the whole canyon is transfigured, as if all the life and light of centuries of sunshine stored up and condensed in the rocks was now being poured forth as from one glorious fountain, flooding both earth and sky. End of chapter 24, part 1 of Steep Trails. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox. Chapter 24, part 2 of Steep Trails. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Steep Trails by John Muir. Chapter 24, Part 2. The Grand Canyon of the Colorado. Strange to say, in the full white effulgence of the midday hours, the bright colors grow dim and terrestrial in common gray haze, and the rocks, after the manner of mountains, seem to crouch and drowse and shrink to less than half their real stature, and have nothing to say to one, as if not at home. But it is fine to see how quickly they come to life and grow radiant and communicative as soon as a band of white clouds come floating by. As if shouting for joy, they seem to spring up to meet them in hearty salutation, eager to touch them and beg their blessings. It is just in the midst of these dull midday hours that the canyon clouds are born. A good storm cloud, full of lightning and rain on its way to its work on a sunny desert day, is a glorious object. Across the canyon, opposite the hotel, is a little tributary of the Colorado called Bright Angel Creek. A fountain cloud still better deserves the name Angel of the Desert Wells, clad in bright plumage, carrying cool shade and living water to countless animals and plants ready to perish, noble in form and gesture, seeming able for anything, pouring life-giving, wonder-working floods from its alabaster fountains, as if some sky lake had broken. To every gulch and gorge on its favorite ground is given a passionate torrent, roaring, replying to the rejoicing lightning, stones, tons in weight, hurrying away as if frightened, showing something of the way Grand Canyon work is done. Most of the fertile summer clouds of the canyon are of this sort, massive, swelling cumuli, growing rapidly, displaying delicious tones of purple and gray in the hollows of their sun-beaten houses, showering favored areas of the heated landscape, and vanishing in an hour or two. Some, busy and thoughtful-looking, glide with beautiful motion along the middle of the canyon in flocks, turning aside here and there, lingering as if studying the needs of particular spots, exploring side canyons, peering into hollows like birds seeding nest places, or hovering aloft on outspread wings. They scan all the red wilderness, dispensing their blessings of cool shadows and rain where the need is the greatest, refreshing the rocks, their offspring, as well as the vegetation, continuing their sculpture, deepening gorges and sharpening peaks. Sometimes, blending all together, they weave a ceiling from rim to rim, perhaps opening a window here and there for sunshine to stream through, suddenly lighting some palace or temple, and making it flare in the rain as if on fire. Sometimes, as one sits gazing from a high jutting promontory, the sky all clear, showing not the slightest wisp or penciling, a bright band of cumuli will appear suddenly, coming up the canyon in single file, as if tracing a well-known trail, passing in review, each in turn darting its lances and dropping its shower, making a row of little vertical rivers in the air high above the big brown one. Others seem to grow from mere points and fly high above the canyon, yet following its course for a long time, noiseless as if hunting, then suddenly darting lightning at unseen marks, and hurrying on. Or they loiter here and there as if idle, like laborers out of work, waiting to be hired. Half a dozen or more showers may sometimes be seen falling at once, while far the greater part of the sky is in sunshine, and not a raindrop comes nigh one. These thunder showers, from as many separate clouds, looking like wisps of long hair, may vary greatly in effects. The pale, faint streaks are showers that fail to reach the ground, being evaporated on the way down through the dry, thirsty air, like streams in deserts. Many, on the other hand, which in the distance seem insignificant, are really heavy rain, however local. These are the gray wisps well zigzagged with lightning. The darker ones are torrent rain, which on broad, steep slopes of favorable conformation give rise to so-called cloudbursts, and wonderful is the commotion they cause. The gorges and gulches below them, usually dry, break out in loud uproar with a sudden downrush of muddy, boulder-laden floods. Down they all go in one simultaneous gush, roaring like lions rudely awakened, each of the tawny brood actually kicking up a dust at the first onset. Despite the winter months, snow falls over all the high plateau, usually to a considerable depth, whitening the rim and the roofs of the canyon buildings. But last winter, when I arrived at Bright Angel in the middle of January, there was no snow in sight, and the ground was dry, greatly to my disappointment, for I had made the trip mainly to see the canyon in its winter garb. Soothingly I was informed that this was an exceptional season, and that the good snow might arrive at any time. After waiting a few days, I gladly hailed a broad-browed cloud coming grandly on from the west in big, promising blackness, very unlike the white sailors of the summer skies. Under the lee of a rim ledge, with another snow lover, I watched its movements as it took possession of the canyon and all the adjacent region in sight. Trailing its gray fringes over the spiry tops of the great temples and towers, it gradually settled lower, embracing them all with ineffable kindness and gentleness of touch, and fondled the little cedars and pines as they quivered eagerly in the wind like young birds begging their mothers to feed them. The first flakes and crystals began to fly about noon, sweeping straight up the middle of the canyon and swirling in magnificent eddies along the sides. Gradually the hardy swarms closed their ranks, and all the canyon was lost in gray bloom, except a short section of the wall and a few trees beside us, which looked glad with snow in their needles and about their feet as they leaned out over the gulf. Suddenly the storm opened with magical effect to the north over the canyon of Bright Angel Creek, enclosing a sunlit mass of the canyon architecture, spanned by great white concentric arches of cloud like the bows of a silvery aurora. Above these, and a little back of them, was a series of upboiling purple clouds, and high above all, in the background, a range of noble cumuli towered aloft like snow-laden mountains, their pure pearl bosses flooded with sunshine. The whole noble picture, calmly glowing, was framed in thick gray gloom, which soon closed over it, and the storm went on, opening and closing until night covered all. 2 days later, when we were on a jutting point about 18 miles east of Bright Angel and 1,000 feet higher, we enjoyed another storm of equal glory as to cloud effects, though only a few inches of snow fell. Before the storm began, we had a magnificent view of this grander upper part of the canyon, and also of the Coconino Forest and the Painted Desert. The march of the clouds, with their storm banners flying over this sublime landscape, was unspeakably glorious, and so also was the breaking up of the storm next morning, the mingling of silver-capped rock, sunshine, and cloud. Most tourists make out to be in a hurry even here, therefore their days or hours would be best spent on the promontories nearest the hotel. Yet a surprising number go down the Bright Angel Trail to the brink of the inner gloomy granite gorge overlooking the river. Deep canyons attract like high mountains. The deeper they are, the more surely are we drawn into them. On foot, of course, there is no danger whatever, and with ordinary precautions, but little on animals. In comfortable tourist faith, unthinking, unfearing, down go men, women, and children on whatever is offered, horse, mule, or burro, as if saying with John Paul, "Fear nothing but fear." Not without reason, for these canyon trails down the stairways of the gods are less dangerous than they seem, less dangerous than homestairs. The guides are cautious, and so are the experienced, much enduring beasts. The scrawniest Rocinantes and wizened rat mules cling hard to the rocks endwise or sidewise, like lizards or ants. From terrace to terrace, climate to climate, down one creeps in sun and shade, through gorge and gully and grassy ravine, and after a long scramble on foot, at last, beneath the mighty cliffs, one comes to the grand, roaring river. To the mountaineer, the depth of the canyon, from 5,000 to 6,000 feet, will not seem so very wonderful, for he has often explored others that are about as deep. But the most experienced will be awestruck by the vast extent of huge rock monuments, of pointed masonry, built up in regular courses, towering above, beneath, and round about him. By the Bright Angel Trail, the last 1,500 feet of the descent to the river has to be made afoot, down the gorge of Indian Garden Creek. Most of the visitors do not like this part, and are content to stop at the end of the horse trail and look down on the dull brown flood from the edge of the Indian Garden Plateau. By the New Hants Trail, excepting a few daringly steep spots, you can ride all the way to the river, where there is good spacious campground in a mesquite grove. This trail, built by brave Hants, begins on the highest part of the rim, 8,000 feet above the sea, 1,000 feet higher than the head of Bright Angel Trail, and the descent is a little over 6,000 feet, through a wonderful variety of climate and life. Often, late in the fall, when frosty winds are blowing and snow is flying at one end of the trail, tender plants are blooming in balmy summer weather at the other. The trip down and up can be made, afoot, easily in a day. In this way one is free to observe the scenery and vegetation, instead of merely clinging to his animal and watching its steps. But all who have time should go prepared to camp a while on the river bank, to rest and learn something about the plants and animals and the mighty flood roaring past. In cool, shady amphitheaters at the head of the trail, there are groves of white silver fir and Douglas spruce, with ferns and saxifrages that recall snowy mountains. Below these, yellow pine, nut pine, juniper, hop hornbeam, ash, maple, holly-leaved berberis, cawania, spirea, dwarf oak, and other small shrubs and trees. In dry gulches and on taluses and sun-beaten crags are sparsely scattered yuccas, cactuses, agave, etc. Where springs gush from the rocks, there are willow thickets, grassy flats, and bright flowery gardens. In the hottest recesses, the delicate abronia, mesquite, woody compositae, and arborescent cactuses. The most striking and characteristic part of this widely varied vegetation are the cactaceae, strange, leafless, old-fashioned plants with beautiful flowers and fruit, in every way able and admirable. While grimly defending themselves with innumerable barbed spears, they offer both food and drink to man and beast. Their juicy globes and discs and fluted cylindrical columns are almost the only desert wells that never go dry, and they always seem to rejoice the more and grow plumper and juicier the hotter the sunshine and sand. Some are spherical, like rolled-up porcupines, crouching in rock hollows beneath a mist of gray lances, unmoved by the wildest winds. Others standing as erect as bushes and trees, or tall, branchless pillars crowned with magnificent flowers, their prickly armor sparkling, look boldly abroad over the glaring desert, making the strangest forests ever seen or dreamed of. Sirius Giganteus, the grim chief of the desert tribe, is often 30 or 40 feet high in southern Arizona. Several species of tree yuccas in the same desert, laden in early spring with superb white lilies, form forests hardly less wonderful, though here they grow singly or in small lonely groves. The low, almost stemless yucca baccata, with beautiful lily flowers and sweet banana-like fruit, prized by the Indians, is common along the canyon rim, growing on lean, rocky soil beneath mountain mahogany, nut pines, and junipers, beside dense flowery mats, Spirea cespitosa, and the beautifully pinnate-leaved Spirea millifolia. The nut pine, Pinus edulis, scattered along the upper slopes and roofs of the canyon buildings, is the principal tree of the strange dwarf coconino forest. It is a picturesque stub of a pine, about 25 feet high, usually with dead lichened limbs thrust through its rounded head, and grows on crags and fissured rock tables, braving heat and frost, snow and drought, and continuing patiently, faithfully fruitful for centuries, Indians and insects and almost every desert bird and beast come to it to be fed. To civilized people from corn and cattle and wheat field countries, the canyon at first sight seems as uninhabitable as a glacier crevasse, utterly silent and barren. Nevertheless, it is the home of the multitude of our fellow mortals, men as well as animals and plants. Centuries ago it was inhabited by tribes of Indians who, long before Columbus saw America, built thousands of stone houses in its crags, and large ones, some of them several stories high, with hundreds of rooms, on the mesas of the adjacent regions. Their cliff dwellings, almost numberless, are still to be seen in the canyon, scattered along both sides from top to bottom, and throughout its entire length, built of stone and mortar, in seams and fissures like swallows' nests, or on isolated ridges and peaks. The ruins of larger buildings are found on open spots by the river, but most of them aloft on the brink of the wildest, giddiest precipices, sites evidently chosen for safety from enemies, and seemingly accessible only to the birds of the air. Many caves were also used as dwelling places, as were mere seams on cliff fronts, formed by unequal weathering and with or without outer or side walls, and some of them were covered with colored pictures of animals. The most interesting of these cliff dwellings had pathetic little ribbon-like strips of garden on narrow terraces, where irrigating water could be carried to them, most romantic of sky gardens, but eloquent of hard times. In recesses along the river, and on the first plateau flats above its gorge, were fields and gardens of considerable size, where irrigating ditches may still be traced. Some of these ancient gardens are still cultivated by Indians, descendants of cliff dwellers, who raise corn, squashes, melons, potatoes, etc., to reinforce the produce of the many wild food furnishing plants, nuts, beans, berries, yucca and cactus fruits, grass and sunflower seeds, etc., and the flesh of animals, deer, rabbits, lizards, etc. The canyon Indians I have met here seem to be living much as did their ancestors, though not now driven into rock dens. They are able, erect men with commanding eyes, which nothing that they wish to see can escape. They are never in a hurry, have a strikingly measured, deliberate, bearish manner of moving the limbs and turning the head, are capable of enduring weather, thirst, hunger, and overabundance, and are blessed with stomachs which triumph over everything the wilderness may offer. Evidently, their lives are not bitter. The largest of the canyon animals one is likely to see is the wild sheep, or Rocky Mountain bighorn, a most admirable beast, with limbs that never fail, at home on the most nerve-trying precipices, acquainted with all the springs and passes and broken-down, jumpable places in the sheer ribbon cliffs, bounding from crag to crag in easy grace and confidence of strength. His great horns held high above his shoulders, wild red blood beating and hissing through every fiber of him like the wind through a quivering mountain pine. Deer also are occasionally met in the canyon, making their way to the river when the wells of the plateau are dry. Along the short spring streams, beavers are still busy, as is shown by the cottonwood and willow timber they have cut and peeled, found in all the river drift heaps. In the most barren cliffs and gulches, there dwell a multitude of lesser animals, well-dressed, clear-eyed, happy little beasts, wood rats, kangaroo rats, gophers, wood mice, skunks, rabbits, bobcats, and many others, gathering food or dozing in their sun-warmed dens. Lizards, too, of every kind and color, are here enjoying life on the hot cliffs, and making the brightest of them brighter. Nor is there any lack of feathered people. The golden eagle may be seen, and the osprey, hawks, jays, hummingbirds, the mourning dove, and cheery familiar singers, the black-headed grosbeak, robin, bluebird, Townsend's thrush, and many warblers, sailing the sky and enlivening the rocks and bushes through all the canyon wilderness. Here at Hance's River Camp, or a few miles above it, brave Powell and his brave men passed their first night in the canyon on the adventurous voyage of discovery 33 years ago. They faced 1,000 dangers, open or hidden, now in their boats gladly sliding down swift, smooth reaches, now rolled over and over in back-combing surges of rough, roaring cataracts, sucked under in eddies, swimming like beavers, tossed and beaten like castaway drift, stout-hearted, undaunted, doing their work through it all. After a month of this, they floated smoothly out of the dark, gloomy, roaring abyss into light and safety 200 miles below. As the flood rushes past us, heavy laden with desert mud, we naturally think of its sources, its countless silvery branches outspread on thousands of snowy mountains along the crest of the continent, and the life of them, the beauty of them, their history and romance. Its topmost springs are far north and east in Wyoming and Colorado, on the snowy Wind River, Front, Park, and Sawatch ranges, dividing the two ocean waters, and the Elk, Wasatch, Uinta, and innumerable spurs streaked with streams made famous by early explorers and hunters. It is a river of rivers, the Duchesne, San Rafael, Yampa, Dolores, Gunnison, Cochetopa, Uncompahgre, Eagle, and Roaring Rivers, the Green and the Grand, and scores of others with branches innumerable, as mad and glad a band as ever sang on mountains, descending in glory of foam and spray from snowbanks and glaciers through their rocky, moraine-dammed, beaver-dammed channels. Then, all emerging from dark balsam and pine woods and coming together, they meander through wide, sunny park valleys, and at length enter the great plateau and flow in deep canyons, the beginning of the system culminating in this grand canyon of canyons. Our warm canyon camp is also a good place to give a thought to the glaciers which still exist at the heads of the highest tributaries. Some of them are of considerable size, especially those on the Wind River and Sawatch ranges in Wyoming and Colorado. They are remnants of a vast system of glaciers which recently covered the upper part of the Colorado Basin, sculptured its peaks, ridges, and valleys to their present forms, and extended far out over the plateau region. How far, I cannot now say. It appears, therefore, that however old the main trunk of the Colorado may be, all its widespread upper branches and the landscapes they flow through are new-born, scarce at all changed as yet in any important feature since they first came to light at the close of the glacial period. The so-called Grand Colorado Plateau of which the Grand Canyon is only one of the well-proportioned features, extends with a breadth of hundreds of miles from the flanks of the Wasatch and Park Mountains to the south of the San Francisco Peaks. Immediately to the north of the deepest part of the canyon, it rises in a series of subordinate plateaus, diversified with green meadows, marshes, bogs, ponds, forests, and grovy park valleys, a favorite Indian hunting ground, inhabited by elk, deer, beaver, etc. But far the greater part of the plateau is good sound desert, rocky, sandy, or fluffy with loose ashes and dust, dissected in some places into a labyrinth of stream channel chasms, like cracks in a dry clay bed, or the narrow slit crevices of glaciers, blackened with lava flows, dotted with volcanoes and beautiful buttes, and lined with long, continuous escarpments, a vast bed of sediments of an ancient sea bottom, still nearly as level as when first laid down, after being heaved into the sky a mile or two high. Walking quietly about in the valleys and byways of the Grand Canyon City, we learn something of the way it was made, and all must admire effects so great from means apparently so simple. Rain striking light hammer blows, or heavier in streams, with many rest Sundays. Soft air and light, gentle sappers and miners, toiling forever. The big river sawing the plateau asunder, carrying away the eroded and ground waste, and exposing the edges of the strata to the weather. Rain torrents sawing cross streets and alleys, exposing the strata in the same way in hundreds of sections, the softer, less resisting beds weathering and receding faster, thus undermining the harder beds, which fall not only in small weathered particles, but in heavy, sheer, cleaving masses, assisted down from time to time by kindly earthquakes, rain torrents rushing the fallen material to the river, keeping the wall rocks constantly exposed. Thus the canyon grows wider and deeper. So also do the side canyons and amphitheaters, while secondary gorges and cirques gradually isolate masses of the promontories, forming new buildings, all of which are being weathered and pulled and shaken down while being built, showing destruction and creation as one. We see the proudest temples and palaces in stateliest attitudes, wearing their sheets of detritus as royal robes, shedding off showers of red and yellow stones like trees in autumn shedding their leaves, going to dust like beautiful days to night, proclaiming as with the tongues of angels the natural beauty of death. Every building is seen to be a remnant of once continuous beds of sediments, sand and slime on the floor of an ancient sea, and filled with the remains of animals, and every particle of the sandstones and limestones of these wonderful structures to be derived from other landscapes, weathered and rolled and ground in the storms and streams of other ages. And when we examine the escarpments, hills, buttes and other monumental masses of the plateau on either side of the canyon, we discover that an amount of material has been carried off in the general denudation of the region, compared with which even that carried away in the making of the Grand Canyon is as nothing. Thus, each wonder in sight becomes a window through which other wonders come to view. In no other part of this continent are the wonders of geology, the records of the world's old lang syne, more widely opened or displayed in higher piles. The whole canyon is a mine of fossils, in which 5,000 feet of horizontal strata are exposed in regular succession over more than 1,000 square miles of wall space, and on the adjacent plateau region there is another series of beds twice as thick, forming a grand geological library, a collection of stone books covering thousands of miles of shelving, tier on tier, conveniently arranged for the student. And with what wonderful scriptures are their pages filled! Myriad forms of successive floras and faunas, lavishly illustrated with colored drawings, carrying us back into the midst of the life of a past infinitely remote. And as we go on and on, studying this old, old life, in the light of the life beating warmly about us, we enrich and lengthen our own. End of chapter 24, part 2, and end of Steep Trails by John Muir. Read by Dennis Sayers in Modesto, California for LibriVox.